Absolutely. I think, of course, without memory, there would be no imagination. There would be no foundation. And we know from neurological patients who lose kinds of memory, there are different kinds of memory, but who lose autobiographical memory, they have a different relation to the world. And I know my mother, who just died, had dementia in her last years, slowly developing. And of course, she lost the ability to read. She could read, but she couldn't remember what she had just read. And that, of course, means that you lose the continuity of the present, Edmund Husserl might be the best person on this, right? He talked about taking the immediate past into the present and then anticipating what's coming next. It's a dynamic movement. It is not little points in time. So the role of the imagination, even in that simple present, is very important. So how is that we are expecting the next thing? We can only expect the next thing because we've internalized sequences of events and how they're supposed to go, right? Sometimes we're surprised and we have to reorient ourselves, but a good deal of the time we are anticipating the immediate future because of our past understanding. So what does the writer do? The writer, or maybe I should not say the writer, I should say I, as a writer, am always finding stories that feel as if they're already there. Years ago, in an essay, I wrote, "Writing fiction is like remembering what never happened." How can that be? I revisited that phrase twice in 2 essays because I knew that it felt right, but how this works is somewhat mysterious, and I've relied on various subjects to try to expand on that idea. Memory is consolidated or fixed, or we remember because we care about the thing. What we don't care about, we forget. It just goes into the garbage box, if you will, of our own personal history. And that emotion that fixes memories is also at work when we revise our memories over time. We don't mean to do it. We think we're remembering the original memory, but we're actually not. It's not there. And it's not, this seems to be true in neuroscience research, but it's what Sigmund Freud said, long before they were doing that research, and he called it Nachträglichkeit. Which was translated by Strachey, the English translator, as deferred action. I think this is really ugly. So I made my own translation, which is afterliness, right? So in the context of the present, when we remember, it changes. So the act of writing fiction, for me, always has to be emotionally true. The events are rarely true in any documentary sense. But here's another essay I wrote called "Why One Story and Not Another?" A fiction writer can do anything. So how do you know what's right and wrong? A question rarely asked. But I think you know, because whatever it is that you're putting on the page holds a kind of emotional truth. It's in a way a form of retelling a deep story, a meaningful story. But the actual events don't have to bear much resemblance to what actually happened in your own life. Yeah, I think I've long been interested in what we call the mind. What is that? And I think to ask that question that has never been really answered is only to understand different aspects of what we think of as the mind. And at one point in my life, I realized that I knew almost nothing about the biology of thought, right? And it corresponded in the 90s to a moment when neuroscience research was exploding. I thought, okay, I'll start studying, which is what I did, really with basic textbooks, just reading a great deal. I worked on the different parts of the brain. And then I got invited by a scientist to a group that met every month, read papers, and discussed them. It was an interdisciplinary group of neuroscientists, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts. Sometimes there were robotics people working in AI. And for the first year, I was pretty silent. I read the papers, I did my homework, I listened and asked questions. And over time, I gained a very good working knowledge of neuroscience. And as time went on, one becomes also more critical. One begins to see certain problems with the paradigms in neuroscience, and a long essay that hasn't been published yet in Spain, but has been published elsewhere, called The Delusions of Certainty, is about the mind-body problem and how it's affected science, that often has retained that split in a way that I think is incorrect. When I was 11 years old, my mother gave me a small book of selected Emily Dickinson poems. Emily Dickinson is a difficult poet, but she's also a beloved poet. And I think the reason is that they have a huge emotional impact. So I wasn't sure exactly what these poems meant. And many of them I cannot tell you today. I certainly can't paraphrase what these poems are about. But I read them over and over and over again. And it was a kind of opening inside me that was extraordinary. I'll never forget it. And I have to say, I still read Emily Dickinson every week. And one reason I return to her again and again is that she is a poet that exemplifies the far reaches of language. She writes in an English that is extraordinary, and not long ago, perhaps a year ago, I read a beautiful essay by her Spanish translator in which this translator said something like, I can't quote it exactly, that Dickinson hangs at the edge of meaning. It was a beautiful way of talking about her poems. So that was a cataclysm in my life. And the cataclysms after that, as a young person, were mostly novels. David Copperfield, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, another very complex novel that at 13 I did not fully understand, but the emotional impact, again, was huge. There are a number of them, and I don't see why we should keep philosophy out of this. I first read Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher, when I was in my 30s, and I have continued to return not just to phenomenology of perception, but his last book that he never finished, which I find quite difficult. But in recent years, I've been going back to it again and again, and it's the visible and the invisible. Sometimes philosophers knock your socks off, and he writes beautiful. The other philosopher I have to mention, who I consider to be a fiction writer also, is Kierkegaard. Never stop thinking about Kierkegaard. I've been returning to him since I was 15, and he drives me crazy, but I also love him. And the complexities, ironies of his work are such that there's no bottom. I think all the writers I love, that I've mentioned here certainly, have no bottom. I don't fully understand how they did what they did, or the complete meanings. And that's why I never stop going back to them.